Hey everyone, welcome to this explainer. If you're a focused learner trying to really master the nuts and bolts of sustainability accounting, you are in exactly the right place. Today, we're unpacking exactly how construction material entities report their Scope 1 greenhouse gas emissions under the SASB framework. We'll be looking closely at the extractives and minerals processing sector guidelines to get you totally comfortable with metrics EM, CM, 110A.1 and 110A.2. Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with the construction materials standard, move into calculating Scope 1 emissions, figure out regulatory coverage, look at setting reduction targets, and finally, wrap up with analyzing your performance. Simple, right? Let's go. All right, part one, the construction materials standard. So look, producing construction materials, especially cement, is incredibly carbon intensive. We're talking massive on-site fuel combustion and some seriously heavy chemical processes. And even though the industry has definitely made efficiency gains recently, absolute emissions are still climbing just because global production keeps going up. Because it's so carbon heavy compared to other sectors, these companies face massive regulatory risks and potentially way higher operating and capital costs. That's exactly why accurate, standardized reporting is absolutely critical for investors who are trying to evaluate that risk. Moving right along to part two. Calculating Scope 1 emissions. This is where we get into the real math. Let's start with a really precise definition. Under the SASB standard, which piggybacks on the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, Scope 1 emissions are the direct emissions of GHGs from stationary or mobile sources. So what does that actually mean? Well, it includes your production facilities, office buildings, and product transportation, like your marine, road, and rail fleets. The absolute key word here is direct. These are the emissions the entity physically releases into the atmosphere through its own day-to-day operations. Now, what's really interesting about this is that you aren't just tracking carbon dioxide. No way. To comply, you have to capture the emissions of all 7 greenhouse gases covered under the Kyoto Protocol. It's kind of like herding an entire atmospheric cocktail. Alongside CO2, you're gathering data for methane, nitrous oxide, hydrofluorocarbons, perfluorocarbons, sulfur hexafluoride, and nitrogen trifluoride. You're building a totally comprehensive inventory of your atmospheric impact. So how on earth do we combine all 7 of those distinct gases into one clean metric? Think of it like a currency exchange. First up, step 1, you identify the gross global emissions for all those different gases. Next, in step 2, you apply global warming potential, or GWP, values to each specific gas to standardize their actual climate impact. And finally, step 3, you consolidate all that math into a single investor-ready currency, metric tons of CO2 equivalent, or CO2e. Now, I want you to literally burn this number into your memory, 100. When you're applying those GWP values in step 2, the standard explicitly requires you to calculate them using the 100-year time horizon GWP values. To make sure your data is totally standardized across the industry, your go-to source for these multipliers should be the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's 5th Assessment Report. Okay, let's clear up a vital rule about gross emissions. Gross emissions means measuring the greenhouse gases emitted into the atmosphere before, and I mean before, accounting for any offsets, credits, or compensation mechanisms. It's a raw, totally unmitigated metric. You cannot just subtract your purchased carbon offsets or green credits at this stage of the game. The whole goal here is strict operational transparency, so everyone can see your true, unvarnished baseline. To wrap up the calculation of our gross emissions, we really need to talk about organizational boundaries. You must consolidate your greenhouse gas data using the exact same approach you use to consolidate your financial reporting data. This is generally aligned with the financial control approach defined by the GHG protocol. This is absolutely critical, right? It ensures investors are looking at emissions data that perfectly matches the financial data of the operations the entity actually controls. It literally aligns your environmental balance sheet with your financial one. All right, section 3, calculating regulatory coverage. Let's look at financial risk and compliance. So, the standard requires you to disclose the percentage of those gross global emissions that are covered under limiting regulations. SASB defines this exactly as an emissions limiting regulation or program intended to limit or reduce emissions directly, such as cap-and-trade schemes, carbon tax/fee systems, and other emissions control and permit-based mechanisms. Prime examples of this, things like the California Cap-and-Trade Program, the EU Emissions Trading Scheme, or the Quebec Cap-and-Trade System. But here's the catch, and it's a big one. Voluntary systems do not count here. This standard explicitly excludes emissions covered only under voluntary trading systems or reporting-based regulations. This metric is strictly about mandatory compliance risk. Investors need to know exactly what percentage of your carbon output is subject to direct financial penalties, taxes, or hard regulatory caps. It's all about the bottom line. Calculating this percentage is actually pretty straightforward. Step 1, sum up all your Scope 1 CO2e emissions that fall under those mandatory limiting regulations. Step 2, divide that number by the total gross global Scope 1 CO2e you calculated earlier. But step 3 is a vital guardrail. If your operations are subject to more than one overlapping regulation in a specific jurisdiction, you've got to be super careful to exclude double counting. A single emission unit can only be counted once in your numerator. Makes sense, right? Okay, Section 4, Setting Reduction Targets. This shifts our focus from past data to future strategy. When you're laying out your long and short-term strategy to manage emissions, you have to clearly define your reduction targets. And specifically, you must disclose whether your target is absolute or intensity-based. An absolute target means you're committing to reducing the total overall volume of your greenhouse gas emissions, period, regardless of how much your company grows. On the flip side, an intensity-based target means you aim to reduce emissions relative to a specific metric denominator. For instance, reducing emissions per metric ton of cement produced. Knowing which type of target you're using is absolutely essential for tracking real progress over time. Alongside defining the type of target, there are a few other essential disclosures needed to build a complete strategic picture. You've got to report the scope of the target, meaning what percentage of your total emissions this actually applies to. You need to declare the base year, the target year, and the exact percentage reduction you're shooting for against that base year. And finally, you have to outline the mechanisms for achieving this. This structured transparency is exactly what allows investors to see how, when, and where a company actually plans to decarbonize. And that brings us to our final section, Section 5, Analyzing Your Performance. To give investors a truly meaningful performance analysis, entities need to discuss the actual tangible activities and investments required to hit these goals. Are you relying on energy efficiency upgrades? Maybe you're transitioning to alternative fuels for your kilns, or relying on clinker substitution. These are things that involve significant capital expenditures, and investors need visibility into them. Furthermore, you've got to honestly disclose any risks or limiting factors that might derail these plans. We're talking supply chain bottlenecks, regulatory shifts, or even technological limitations. And this brilliantly illustrates just how rigorous and granular the SASB standard gets. You are actually required to discuss the scope of your strategies by breaking them down across different business units, specific geographies, or distinct emission sources. You also need to tie these strategies directly back to those specific regional emissions limiting programs we talked about earlier, like the EU emissions trading scheme. It forces companies to show exactly how their high-level global sustainability talk actually translates into action across localized operations and specific tax jurisdictions. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a quick question to chew on. How might your transparent disclosures and reduction targets influence your access to capital in an increasingly carbon-conscious market? The way you manage and report this data literally impacts how investors view your long-term viability and operational risk. Thank you so much for joining me today to demystify the SASB construction materials standard. Keep learning, keep analyzing, and I will catch you in the next one.